Welcome to Coffee with Kelly. I'm your co-host, Ethan Woodman, Product Marketing Specialist for Crisis Go, and I'm joined by my colleague, Kelly Moor, School Safety Analyst for Crisis Go. In this episode, we'll be discussing two crucial aspects of school safety. First, we will delve into the importance of transitioning from an inactive to an active participant in school. School safety is not just a noun, but a verb, and it requires everyone to contribute actively to create a safe environment. We will explore the differences between inactive and active participants in school safety, the benefits of being an active participant, and suggestions on how to transition to that role. Second, we will provide an overview of the expectations and challenges associated with school safety and discuss the expectations from different groups, including political, public, and parents. We'll also explore the expectations for a safe campus and district, authorized access, emergency training, a safe and supportive environment, communication, reunification, and collaboration with emergency responders. Lastly, we'll touch on the challenges of meeting expectations, possible solutions and starting points, and the importance of documentation and record keeping. Stay tuned for actionable tips on how to meet the expectations of school safety and the importance of prevention and preparedness. Good morning, Kelly. How are you?
I'm well. How are you?
I'm doing pretty good. I'm on my second cup of coffee, so I'm ready to go.
I've already lost count.
Did you have your cowboy coffee this morning?
Every morning.
You have that every morning?
Uh-huh.
Oh my.
Yep. Every morning. My wife likes it.
Oh, so you both drink cowboy coffee?
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Okay. I can't get over the graininess part.
You don't get it if you do it correctly.
Oh, okay.
Did you try it?
I did not.
So you're making an assumption right now.
I am.
Right.
So, Kelly, we're on our 6th episode. Can you believe it?
That's crazy, isn't it?
It's awesome. So, remind our listeners just briefly on kind of what we've talked about. So maybe they're coming in for the first time. And so let's give them a recap of things they may have missed so that they can go back and listen to those episodes.
Yeah. So we started basically from the foundation, introductions of who we were. And then we started looking at what school safety is, what it looks like. We talked about learning, lifelong learners, and how people start to get into this process by becoming a student of school safety and understanding those nuances for school safety, where it's something that's new to most people in the education industry. And they have to look at learning a new skill set, a new knowledge set. And they really have to start understanding the purpose of school safety and how they get involved. So we also talked about building a school safety climate culture and infusing that into everything that they do. When I talk about infusing, I'm talking about infusing. So everything that you do from a district level to a building level, ask the question, how does this impact our safety? A lot of times it's not going to impact your safety. Sometimes somebody may say something when you ask that question that you hadn't thought about. How does this impact our safety? And when I say that, I mean like when you're developing curriculum, how does it impact our safety? How does it impact the emotional and mental health of our students? Is that important? Yes. How do we do that? So start asking those questions and start building as we go. When you do drills and exercises, do those with purpose, right? And then as we start to develop our processes, our policies, and so forth, then we start looking at how do we create valid processes to begin with, and how do we improve on them on a regular basis? How do we make suggestions for improvements? How do we track those improvements? How do we make our programs better? We talked about not having this unrealistic goal that we're going to do it perfect every time, but we should be improving every time. And as long as we can keep that process going, it's going to do a lot of things for your safety program. First, it will improve. It'll improve on a much quicker pace if you start asking questions. Why did we do this? How did we do it? Were we successful? Why were we successful? If we weren't successful, why not? And how do we correct those? We also talked about if success was part of the program, or if the reason you succeeded was because you got lucky, then you need to pretty much get that out of that process. So that's kind of where we're at right now. And kind of, if you went back and looked at our blogs and listened to our other podcasts, that's kind of in a nutshell what you would be learning.
All right. So then now today we're going to be talking about, and this is going to be a really interesting one, I think. It may be a little bit challenging. We're going to be talking about the difference between an inactive and active participant in school safety.
Yep, we are. We're really going to test the comfort zone because this is the threshold, right?
This is like when you really start get down to business.
Yeah, because it's easy for somebody to sit back, press a button, and wait. It may cause some anxiety. It may cause some emotional trauma, but they're not actually doing anything. They're just waiting, right? And by doing that, they're not really participating in their own safety. And we can get into a couple of examples of that. But this is that threshold between sitting around waiting for somebody to help you to actually transitioning to helping yourself and your students and other people on your campus.
So what is the difference between an inactive and active participant in terms of beliefs and attitudes?
Generally speaking, the difference is that it's somebody else's job to save me, to protect me, to keep me safe. The active participant believes that it is their job to protect themselves. They actively take an interest in protecting others. They take actions to protect others, to help others. And we see it all the time in emergencies across the board. We see the ones that wait for somebody to come help them, and then some that are actively getting into the process. They're participating, actively participating. There's a great quote in the movie World War Z with Brad Pitt.
Oh yeah, that was a good one.
The zombie movie, right?
Yeah.
And they're in the very first stages of the movie, they get into trying to evade all these zombies that are coming, right? And they end up in an apartment building where his connections allow him to arrange for a rescue at the top of the building. And on the way up the building, they run into this family, and the family gives them shelter for a little bit because they were able to hold off the zombies from advancing. And I forget exactly how they did it, but they did it. And so they spent the night in the apartment. Now it's time to start moving again. And Brad Pitt looks at the father and the mother of the family and says, I can help you. Why don't you come with me? And they looked and said, the government told us that we should stay here. We should stay inside. And Brad Pitt responds, well, I don't know what's going on out there. I'm not really an expert in what's going on, but I've been in a lot of places with disease, war, other tragedies where people are dying in numbers. And I found out this: those who move live. And what he's really saying there is those who participate in their own safety and take accountability and get away from where they're likely to become a victim, or do everything to make sure that they're not victims, then that's where people live, right? And it turns out it was tragic, right? Because they stayed, and as they're getting onto the helicopter, one of the children runs up and says, Mom and Dad are gone because they stayed in their room and they were overrun.
Yep, I remember that part.
Yeah. So, that's in a nutshell, that's what active participation means. You're taking responsibility for your safety and the safety of those that are in your care and others that are immediately accessible to you.
And I think what we've kind of talked about previously is, this isn't just involving, physically moving around and physically taking an action necessarily. It's the foundation of this can be simply just learning and skill building. It might be difficult to.
It all starts there, right?
Right. It might be difficult to take that action if you don't know what you're doing.
Yeah.
You don't just run into a fire without any equipment. So a part of this is taking the time to learn.
Yeah, I mean, that's what we're really talking about, right? It's that being involved in that whole process, starting from the prevention, mitigation phase, preparations, be preparing yourself. Oftentimes when we talk about preparations, we take it from a different context. We're talking about, survival in an emergency. So do we have food for the day? Do we have first aid equipment? Do we have this? While that's all part of preparation, mentally and physically training yourself, your body, your mind as to what you're going to do is as important, if not more important, than having 5 gallons of water per day per person for the length of the emergency, right? So, I mean, we can take things and say we're prepared, but are we really prepared to respond to that? And that's part of this process, actively participating, learning what your responsibilities are, learning what the expectations are. And we'll get into that in a little bit later in the podcast about expectations. What are they? How do we meet them and why we should meet them? So we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But you have to understand what those are, your responsibilities are, what your expectations are, what are the expectations of you and what you're going to do, and participate in that, actively do so.
So I think for some, this might, be an easy question, but, what are some benefits of being an active participant in school safety?
First of all, you can perform the way that is expected of you because you'll meet the expectations that have been set for you. You'll know what your responsibilities are and how to meet those responsibilities. But being prepared and being able to respond in any situation reduces your stress, increases your confidence. It makes you a better problem solver. We talked about this last podcast, I believe, about emergency services or emergency management being about problem solving, identifying problems and working through those, being a critical thinker. It'll improve that process. And frankly, if you're a good problem solver and a good critical thinker and you know what you're supposed to do and you can do it and you're confident in doing that, that increases your confidence in all aspects of your life. It really gives you that ability to say, oh, I can tackle this because I can tackle this emergency. And the emergencies are thought to be the most stressful things that happen to us in our lifetime. All the routine stuff, while work may be stressful and so forth, but when we just start talking about emergencies and how to survive emergencies and what we should do there, that tends to bring that stress level up. But if you take an active role and participate actively in that process, then it reduces that stress, reduces that trauma that you might feel, increases your resiliency, and makes you more effective, not only in the emergency itself where we need you most, but in all aspects of life.
So when we're talking about going from an inactive to active participant, who are we talking to? Really?
Everybody.
Okay.
Yeah. Because you don't, while we train and exercise for specific roles, few of us will actually be in that specific role at that specific time. It seldom goes step A, step B, step C, et cetera, until you're done, right?
Yep.
So we may be in a position, and this is one reason that It's important that you become a student of this and not just, okay, I'm a teacher. This is all I have to do. This is my role as a teacher. But we might be in a position where we're the only person there, or we're in the best position to start leading through the emergency for whatever reason. We could be on a field trip. We could be at a field trip where there's lots of schools, different schools from different districts. And if there's an emergency there and you know what to do and you know how to do it, then you're going to be more than just the teacher responsible for your class. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
Yep, that's me.
Learning those roles and understanding what it is. That's why it's important for us to actively participate and really look at what does that mean and when do we transition to that role so that we understand other people's roles. I'm not saying tomorrow you have to know everything, but once you conquer your responsibilities, start learning somebody else's. Start learning your safety team. Someday you may do that if you get promoted through the ranks in the school systems. You might get those. So understanding the foundational level of your emergency protective actions and keeping your kids safe and those immediately around you. Take the next step. Continue that process.
So you were talking about transitioning. So let's say that I'm a school staff and I kind of realize after listening to this, I say, you know what? I'm really not taking an active role. Where do I start?
You got to say, I'm going to start. So you got to be bold there, right? You have to talk yourself into going into the zone where it's not comfortable for you. Take that first step. Take the second step. Take the third step. And learn to be uncomfortable. That's where we learn. We already talked about this. We learn from failures, but the time to fail is when you're learning, not when you're actually applying what you have learned. Take the time now when you have it. Hopefully we have it. Take that time, get uncomfortable, learn it until you are comfortable, then take the next step.
That's probably where the drills come in handy, right? Is, you do these drills in school and like go at it, like just fail as many times as you can, because that way you're going to
learn to do it correctly, but then change the scenario. Well, what happens if this would occur? Or let's change the time of day, right? A earthquake or a active shooter in pretty much what is driving this conversation, right?
Yep.
Is different if everyone is in their classroom versus everyone's at lunch, or it's student drop off, or it's student pickup, or it's the Friday night football game. It's the same type of event, but how you respond to that is completely different. And we get into this comfort zone of doing fire drills when everyone's in class, seated, and behaving themselves. Now try to do that when all of your elementary kids are outside at recess. Try to get them from stop doing what they're doing to get back into the class for a lockdown. It's easy to do a lockdown
when you're already in the room.
When you're already in your class.
Yeah.
It's easy to do a secure when you're already in the class.
Right.
It's easy to do an evacuation when everyone is seated in their seats, behaving themselves, and the teacher says, it's time to do a fire drill with an evacuation. Please line up. They do, and they follow each other out to the evacuation assembly area. Those are easy. Now take the next step. How do you get somebody from the playground in? How do you get somebody from the student drop-off in? What happens if you're having this violent event at the student drop-off and now you have to shelter a bunch of parents? How do you get them all out of their car? What is the traffic impact of that event for those waiting to drop off their kids. What are they doing? Challenge yourself. Challenge the status quo. If this is what we've been doing for 50 plus years, then let's try something different and see what happens.
Safe to say that you should probably never do the same drill twice.
I mean, it's not never the same drills twice, but vary that drill. You want to do it
Add some variables to it.
Yeah. And you want to do it till you can get it right, and then add a variable to it.
What is that phrase that you said before?
Yeah. So in the professional athletic world, sports world, they train not only to get it right, but they train until they can't get it wrong.
I love that one. That one's so good.
And that's what you kind of got to do, but that's part of the process. Yeah. Train until you can't get it wrong, and then add a variable to it.
See, I imagine, like, what if every person in a school knew every role and like what needed to be done in that role? Like, how strong would that school be?
Is that a rhetorical question?
It kind of, yeah. I mean,
right. It would be huge, right? And that's what we're striving for. Yep. That's what the practitioners of school safety. That's what we want. That's what the public wants. That's what the community wants. That's what the parents want. Is they want everybody to have the ability to go to school and be confident that if something happens, their kids are safe. Most people just don't understand exactly what that involves. You can't just push the button and wait for somebody to come save you. You have to actively participate. We talked about this before. Participation starts before the incident, long before the incident. Prevention starts long before. Everything starts with policies and procedures, putting a plan together, putting a program together, practicing that, then applying what you have learned in prevention. So identifying concerning behavior, problem behavior, violent behavior, deal with them. Deal with them when they're in kindergarten. Deal with them when they're in first grade. Don't let them fester until 12th grade, where the kid that you should have dealt with in first grade realizes or believes in their mind, literally believes that violence is the only solution to my problem, whatever that problem is. But violence is the only solution. That's why we have what we have. It's not just a solution. It's the solution.
Yep. So I think in the blog, you touch on managing anxiety through active participation.
Yep. We talked about that a little bit. Anxiety and stress are created by the unknown. We don't know what's going to happen to us. The more knowledge you have about what's going to happen or what's the potential, the more you can deal with it, the more you can mitigate it, prevent it, all of that stuff, right? So when you have that anxiety, that causes stress, that causes more trauma at the end of everything, if you survive it. But addressing it head on with making what we call your weaknesses, your strengths, then that builds that confidence, that reduces that anxiety, that reduces the stress, increases your resiliency, increases the probability that you will survive, and increases the potential that it will never happen in the first place. If you go back to your last question of what would happen if everybody knew exactly what they were doing, everyone was actively participating, and so forth, what would happen? All of that stuff would be reduced. You would likely have the prevention of incidences because people who are contemplating violence as a solution know that you're going to do something, know that you're going to identify it quickly, know that if they're on the pathway to violence, and we'll talk about that later, but if they're on the pathway to violence, that you will identify them early and you will deal with them. So you're likely to prevent that just by having everyone in your school actively participate in the safety program from start to finish.
So maybe just give a recap of what we've discussed so far.
Sure. We're going to call it the transition from what a lot of people would say is the victim mentality to the survivor mentality. The inactive participant, somebody who sits there and waits for somebody to come save them, somebody who believes it's somebody else's job to save them, that their safety is the responsibility of somebody else, to somebody who says, I'm responsible for my safety. I'm responsible for your safety. I'm responsible for the safety of my kids. I'm responsible for the safety of the teachers and the classrooms next to me. That's what we're talking about. And actively participating, taking those steps, challenging the status quo, challenging yourself, learning what you need to do, mastering that, taking the next step, learning what the next step is, mastering that, and just becoming that student in this whole process. We touch on it in the blog, and to give you an example of somebody who was an inactive participant in his safety. I had an acquaintance of mine. Our kids played water polo together, and he calls me up. We'll call him Jim. And Jim calls me up. I'm a commander at the sheriff's department, and he calls me up and says, "Hey, Kelly, I was crossing the street, and before I started crossing the street, I see a car coming, and I realize it's a deputy sheriff. And as I start to cross, I realize he's not slowing down. He's not going to stop. But I'm in the crosswalk, and he's required. So I keep going. And to a point where I had to jump out of the way. And as I jump out of the way, I realize he's looking at his phone. You need to do something about that." And so I go through all of the basic questions of, did you get the car number? Could you recognize him? Do you know who he was? So forth. And he couldn't provide me really any identifying information. And so I dealt with the one, not stopping for the crosswalks and being on your phone while you're driving, which is illegal in the state of California. And I said, "But Jim, you saw the car coming." He goes, "Yeah. Why did you go into the crosswalk?" And he says, "Because he's supposed to stop." I said, "Yes, but that really doesn't help you if he doesn't. The law doesn't help you if he continues on his path, violates the law, and hits you. That doesn't help." And he goes, "But I have the right to be there." And I said, "I get that. But the fact of the matter is that right that you exercise caused you to lose if you get hit, and it does you no good." So he believes that it's that deputy's position that he should and he has to stop. But he gambled with that because he didn't stop and he had to jump out of the way. Actively participating in your safety, you would look and say, "Hey, that deputy is coming pretty quick. I'm going to wait till he goes by. I'm going to wave at him as he goes by. I'm going to call his commander because I know who he is. And I'm going to say, 'Oh, this deputy driving unit 1234 just blew this and almost hit me. If I had gone out in the road, he would have hit me. But I didn't because I saw that he wasn't slowing down. And oh, by the way, he was looking at his phone when he passed through the sidewalk or the crosswalk.'" That's somebody who's actively participating in their safety, not relying on somebody else to do something correctly or not do something correctly.
So that actually happened.
Yep.
Wow. I mean, it's funny when you're saying it because it's just so silly. Because I'm like, I learned to look both ways when I cross the street as a very young child. So
Right.
But it's a great example. I don't know if you're like attributing it to this, but it's from a school safety standpoint. It's there's of course there's laws and stuff, and you can't. You're not supposed to murder people. You're not supposed to come in and hurt people in a school, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't happen.
That's correct. right? And taking an active, and in fact, in some states, it's a law, a mandate, a requirement for you to keep your door shut and locked. But are people doing it? No.
Is that like a residential thing, or are you still
No, in schools.
Okay.
In schools. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
There's policies in a lot of other school districts where it says you shall, while you're in the class instructing, keep your doors locked.
So what would happen if you didn't keep your doors locked and, worst case scenario, someone comes in and hurts one of your students? Does that set you up to be like liable?
Good. So even people that have immunity, implied immunity, are liable if they weren't doing what they were supposed to. They were negligent. It's not a foolproof shield, implied immunity. Law enforcement has it in most states. Some states are looking to remove that, but then you can get sued for anything.
Oh boy.
Right? And so they do that so that you don't get sued frivolously.
Gotcha.
But you can still file the lawsuit. They just look at it and go, yeah, there's no merit here. The problem comes in when there is merit. And we're seeing lawsuits that come out because people didn't do what they were expected to do, didn't do what they were required to do. In fact, took roles on that they were not qualified for, or they did not understand what they were doing, and so forth, right? So theoretically, if you're required by law to shut the doors and lock them while you're teaching, and you don't, you violated the policy and you're now outside the scope of the district's expectations.
Wow.
So, I mean, it's there.
There's a lot to think about on that one. So maybe that's a good transition into expectations. You wrote a really great blog that talked about all the different types of expectations. Probably another challenging one for a lot of us.
Yeah. So what is the expectation? Many of us look at the federal level, nationally, what is the expectation? There's this disconnect between the expectation and understanding how to accomplish that, how to meet those expectations. So if you look at the difference in the industry, the K-12 industry, what are the expectations? Keeping your kids safe. If you look at the expectations from the parents, they want three things, generally speaking. I want to be able to send my kid to school and they arrive safely at school. Once they're at school, they're provided a safe, supportive environment to learn and meet their potential. And once you are done educating them or involving them in activities, they come home to me in the same condition that they left that day. Kind of a simple expectation.
Yeah, it's simple, but there's a lot to it. Yep.
Right? And the challenge here is understanding what that means and how do we accomplish that. Again, we go back to when we were talking about systems in the ecosystems. I can make your school look like a prison. Most parents don't want that. Most schools don't want that. Most communities don't want that. So you have to, give and take on what that means to you and your community. We can have that discussion, but what are your expectations? So many of my expectations, right, are the ability to keep people who have no business on my campus off my campus. That's access control.
Yep.
If I have somebody who is showing concerning behaviors, mental health issues, emotional issues, acting out violently, poor coping skills, poor problem solving skills. If I have somebody like that, I address them. That's the prevention. I support them. I give them what they need to get them as close to the norm as we possibly can. Then I help them learn. I help them remove the stresses and the mental health issues connected around learning. There's a lot of that going on, especially with the COVID and coming out of the COVID. I don't project my stress, my mental health issues, my emotional issues on my kids. There's a lot of that going on. I'm stressed and I can't handle this. You should be stressed. You should be doing this. You should be thinking this way. You should be thinking that way. And so that they're causing stress. We shouldn't do that. We should teach them in an environment that's, I don't want to say sterile, but we should teach them in a non-stressed environment.
Yes.
Right. So, and then getting them home. How do we get them home? How do we make sure that they do that correctly? How do we make sure they are picked up in a safe, orderly manner? How do we do that? Those are things that you're going to have to answer as a school district. How do we do this? I've got my way, but is mine going to fit your way? How do we make sure that that happens? Who are our partners in that? If something happens, how do we give every person on our campus, whether it's a student, a staff member, a contractor, a visitor, how do we give them the best opportunity to survive? If you want laws to be created and mandates to be created, that's good, I suppose. But we really shouldn't need that when we're talking about our kids and the expectations of sending our kids to school. We should be working on that actively, participating in that. The federal government, when we start talking about expectations and school safety, there's almost always a political spin on that. If it were up to me, I would take the politics completely out of it if you could. I know you can't, but I would take it out as much as possible in understanding the situation that we are in and work from there. The political solutions are solutions that are created by people who have very little experience in the school systems, people who haven't been there in 30 years. They don't know what's going on in the school systems. They don't know the challenges that we have. And oftentimes we have solutions that come out that politically, if this would have happened, we would have prevented that. First of all, you can't say that. Second of all, oftentimes those solutions, had they been in place at the time of the event, they would not have prevented that incident from occurring. I'll give you an example. The active shooter incident that I was the commander of in 2014 involved a kid who had some emotional issues, and he collected guns, he collected ammunition before he went out and committed all these violence acts on his roommates and the community at large. Politicians after this came in and enacted a law in the state of California called the Gun Violence Restraining Orders. And they were saying, if this was in place, this would have stopped this. And that gun violence restraining order was put in place so that people who had a concern about somebody could prohibit that person they were concerned about from purchasing and buying firearms. At the time that my suspect was amassing his arms and his ammunition and putting his plans into motion, nobody thought he would do that. Nobody would have thought to have this restraining order put on him because it just didn't apply. They wanted us to search his apartment. Why didn't you search his apartment? You were there. We can't just go around searching people's apartments.
Yeah, I think there's a law around that.
Right. And so that's what we're talking about. Are these laws and mandates out there? Are they really helpful, or are they just a political message? This is what we're going to do. Look, I did this. This is how we're going to attack this.
Yeah, I think in most cases, there's probably another agenda behind it.
Right? Yeah. And I don't want to get too political here, but if you're going to make a political solution, at least make it so that it would address the issues that just occurred. I'm not a big fan. I think politics should provide the funding for things. I think that's reasonable to ask. I'm not sure that they should be driving school safety. I think schools should be driving school safety. I don't think we should require laws. I think we should have people who are wanting to do that. If we do that, if we do it from the bottom up instead of the top down, then we start solving our own solutions and we can take the politics out of it.
I'm right there with you. I like that idea. Is that like a call to action for all the people that work in schools to kind of step up and say, hey, let's all work together and create bills and that can actually be useful.
All I'm asking is that you actively participate. If you actively participate, you won't need the mandates.
That's very true.
You'll figure out what you're supposed to do and you'll do it right because you're the ones there. You won't need the mandates. You might need funding, but you're not going to need mandates. You're not going to need the laws. You're going to need one law. Every school, private or public, shall be required to have a comprehensive safety program. That's the only law you need. If you have people actively participate, you will meet those expectations. If you're actively participating and you're actively solving your problem in your school, you will meet the expectations, the highest expectations that are out there. And that's the expectation of the parents. When I send my child to school, I'm going to get him back at the end of the day. That's the expectation that you have to meet.
Maybe we can call it Kelly's Law.
Kelly's Law.
That's already.
I don't have a law named after me.
It's already a thing. Yeah.
There's a Kelly's Law?
Yeah, it's about missing persons.
Oh.
So we can't do that.
We could spell it differently.
It's true. The coffee with Kelly Law.
Right. How about the school safety law?
There you go. So I'm trying to think, what would have more effect on a school if they didn't abide by the expectations of political or the public or parents. So let's say, a lot of them are probably, unsaid or whatnot. So like you have an expectation from the public or parents and let's say those expectations aren't met. What are some things that can happen? Like what can the public or parents do after the fact?
So you're talking lawsuits.
Yeah.
That's the remedy. If you have a child who is adversely affected, mm-hmm. and I say it purposely, adversely affected, runs the gamut from emotional trauma to injury, death. If you have somebody who is adversely affected, they are going to look at somebody to blame. Once they find somebody to blame, the remedy is a lawsuit. The courts go in and they say, yes, we agree with you, or no, we don't, and they dismiss it, or we agree with you, and then they attach a judgment to it, which is monetary, typically. Yeah. And so it's the lawsuits. And we talked about this in the first or second podcast about some of the lawsuits that are out there and the amounts that are out there, 100 million, 27 billion with a B. And those are real numbers. All you have to do is articulate damages, articulate the negligence, articulate somebody who's at fault. And oftentimes it's multiple people. It's the teacher who was in charge of that child didn't practice due care. It was the safety coordinator for the building, of the safety committee in the building. They didn't do it correctly. There weren't enough policies. The school board didn't mandate the safety program be in place. They didn't follow up on it. They didn't take an interest in it. It wasn't part of their daily briefings. This is what we're doing for safety today. There's all of these things. And as soon as they find somebody that did something wrong, it becomes this structure that was also because the teacher is going to say, well, I was never taught that. Oh, you weren't? No, this is what I taught. we did fire drills. In fire drills, we evacuate. We were taught lockdown drills 2 years ago, and we haven't practiced one since. We haven't done an active shooter drill, so we don't know what goes on. So typically our active shooter drills, our lockdowns, last 5 minutes. I didn't realize they were going to last 4 hours. I didn't realize that I couldn't leave after this 5 minutes because every time we practice, we left. We had that. I had that just last week. I talked to a school in California, a principal for an elementary school where they had a suspicious subject on campus and they were concerned about his behavior. So they decided to put them into a secure, which is a modified lockdown for those not familiar with the standard response protocols, until they found that. During the middle of that, it was not a drill, it was an actual alert. One teacher decided she'd been in this secure position long enough. Nobody was communicating with her. So she thought it was over. She takes her kids out for recess when the bell rang. And then all of a sudden she says, "Where is everybody?" And realizes that they're still supposed to be in this secured position. And, so it happens. People, if that had been a lockdown because they saw somebody on campus with a gun and they're locking everybody down, and then that teacher says, "Oh, I think I've been here long enough," and walks out and presents her kids to the shooter, who's at fault there? That's a question that needs to be answered by you, the listening public. Did she meet the expectations? No. Did she understand what they were? Probably not. Who's responsible for doing that? Somebody else. Or I am, as an active participant.
All right, Kelly. So maybe we can go over just briefly what are some possible solutions and starting points for meeting expectations, whether those are political, public, or from parents. Where do we start?
So we get it back into you have to actively participate. So in order to meet expectations, you have to know what they are. So sit down and define what those are, not only as an umbrella for the safety program, but each person, each level, teachers, custodians, cafeteria workers, cooks, librarians, counselors, safety team members, assistant principals, superintendents, assistant superintendents, all of those people, safety coordinators. What are the expectations? Sit down, figure that out, define them, and then train them. They're not going to be the same for every school. The overarching goal of getting your kids to school safely, keeping them safe and supported while they're there, and getting them home safely is a good place to start. Then participate in that process of figuring out what that means to you, your school district, and the different schools. The schools, especially if you're in a large district, the schools are not all going to be the same. You're going to have different demographics. You're going to have different neighborhood makeups. You're going to have different weather patterns. You're going to have different procedures for getting kids to school. Some of them will be bused in. Some of them, in some areas, like the school district I lived in, they didn't own any buses. Everyone walked to school or they got to school on their own. So that's a different dynamic than somebody who sends their kid out to the end of the driveway and waits for the school bus to pick them up. So understand what your makeup is and start defining those expectations. What do we expect our people to do? Advise them of it, train them on it, and start working that way. And that's all part of this participation. And in fact, one of your expectations should be, we expect everybody to participate in the safety of their schools and their individual safety, in your own safety, and the safety of your kids and everyone on campus. So they understand right up front, they expect me to participate here. What does that mean? Should I get first aid training? Probably. Should I get stop the bleed training? Probably. Should I get CPR training and AED training? Probably. Should I be able to communicate with people? Definitely. What does that mean? two-way communication, or do I just want to be notified that something's happened to me? Those are decisions that you're going to have to make as a district in a school. That's the solution. Participate. Set the expectations, define them, and then participate in your own safety. Pretty simple, huh?
Yeah. It sounds simple. There's a lot to it, but I think, once people, it's that first step. It's like that first leap, it's really scary, but like once you do it, once you start getting into it, it'll come a lot easier as you go.
Take what we talked about, that problem solving, that critical thinking.
Yep.
That's your first step. Understand that process. And then you'll know when you start to get confused or not know where you need to start, what's your problem? What is your first step? Identify what you need to do. Identify the alternatives, resources, get a plan going, determine a plan, identify the plan, implement it, right? Observe, and then transition into the new plan. If you understand that process, then you can take that first step much better, much quicker. It's easier because it's already defined for you what that step is.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Coffee with Kelly. We have discussed two crucial aspects of school safety: transitioning from an inactive to an active participant and meeting the expectations for school safety. Remember, being an active participant can reduce stress, trauma, and anxiety during emergencies, improve problem-solving skills, and increase confidence in other aspects of life. Meeting expectations is crucial for the safety of our students and teachers, and we urge you to take action and meet those expectations, emphasizing the importance of prevention and preparedness. Be sure to subscribe to our podcast and hit that notification bell for future episodes. If you're looking to improve safety in your school, check us out at crisisgo.com. Join us next time as we continue our discussion on school safety.